ground properly, which is going to rob you of distance, natural distance, but is also going to rob you of rotation as well. In this video, we're going to talk about another piece of the setup. Yes, the basics again. You have to be good at these basics because they dramatically affect how you move and how you strike the golf ball. Had a lesson this week with one of my college students that started to drift a little bit with his stance width, and it affected a lot of things in his swing. And I don't care if you're a college player or you've been playing this game for 50 years, this is something you have to work on. So we're gonna head over to the lesson tee right now. I'm gonna go over the importance of stance width, how it affects things, give you a process to get it better, and also give you some drills. Yes, you can work on stance width with drills that you can do at home to improve this. We're gonna come back to the desk after. I'm gonna show you the before and after. We got his body more stable, we used the ground better, and he hit the golf ball more centered and further, not because of anything dynamic we did. It all went back to his stance width. So let's head over to the tee, let's talk about it. This is an important one, so make sure you bookmark this video, save it, share it to somebody, and let's get to work. So let's not sugarcoat this. Stance width is something simple. It is something that everybody, and I don't care if you're a beginner golfer, a senior golfer, a tour player, or anybody in between, it is something that everybody needs to pay attention to, but if you pay attention to it, it'll never be an issue. Just like a lot of the other fundamentals and the basics. But if you're not paying attention to it, it may start to drift on you. And Anthony, the college player I was talking about, is a perfect example of that. He's highly skilled, but he wasn't paying attention to one simple piece of the puzzle, and it ended up causing a couple things that led to him struggling with his consistency. And make sure you stick around to the end of the video because I will show you just a quick before and after of his swing and how it affected one main piece of the puzzle. And if this is one of the first videos of mine you are watching, I want to say welcome and thank you. My name is TJ Valentine. I'm a 25-year PGA teaching professional. I've given well over 30,000 lessons in person and remotely over the past quarter century. And I really hope my knowledge, my passion, my experiences, and my stories, and my students, like today, can help you improve or gain a little bit more knowledge. Because my job, whether it's with people that I directly coach, or even all of you out there through that camera, is to help you become a better player and ultimately have a little bit more fun. So consider subscribing if you're not a subscriber, hit that like button, all that good stuff. And let's have a little more fun. Let's get you playing a little better golf. So as I always say in my videos, your mileage may vary with all of this. Everybody is built differently. Everybody's minds are different. Everybody's bodies are different. Everybody has different limitations. Everybody has different skill sets overall. So there are nuances to even the basics, the fundamentals that may vary from player to player. So for example, we're talking about stance width today. I'm going to go over a solid process to make sure you're in the same stance width every single time. But certain players may need a little wider stance width than I'm going to talk about today. Or certain players may need a little narrower stance width that I'm going to talk about today. And that's always the challenging thing of doing these videos where I'm not working with somebody in front of me, or I'm not working with a person remotely who I see their golf swing. I can interact with them. I'm working with all of you out there. So I'm going to give you a very good general process and a great starting point. But really, I want you to understand why stance width is so important overall. So I'm going to start with an iron, and I am going to give you a process to get into the proper stance width. But first, I want you to understand why stance width is so important. So basic stance width, and I'm just going to quickly jump into this, and then I'm going to talk about the process. You want your feet with irons, and these are stock shots. These are not chip shots. These are not specialty shots. These are stock shots. You want your feet in general to be shoulder width or slightly inside your hips if you're looking down. And that's in general. Like I said, your mileage may vary with certain players. Why though? Why do we want it in this package? Why do we want this setup here? Well, when I'm in this setup,
my legs have created essentially this upside down V, which allows me to form a brace in my right and left legs. If I'm too close, I don't have a brace. I don't have a good brace. So any movement this way or this way, I can get outside of my feet. I lose stability and I lose the ability to formulate that connection with the ground, which is oh so important. So I need to have that upside down V. Now, on the other hand, I have an upside down V here. It's a little wider V, but it's an upside down V. You say, hey, TJ, how come this isn't a good stance width? Well, what ends up happening is, think about if I had a driver in my hand right now. It's on the ground. I don't want to pick it up. But think if I have a driver in my hand right now. That ball position is more off my front foot. The wider my stance is, the further my center is away from the ball, which means I'm going to have to move laterally in order to give myself a chance. Now, that was an extreme wide stance there. I'm pushing myself this way. But that's what I would have to do. That's a little foreshadowing because that's what Anthony was dealing with in his swing. So if I'm too wide, I can have lateral motion issues. So swaying can come from that. Also, if I'm too wide, it actually restricts my ability to rotate properly. Also, it affects my ability to use the ground properly, which is going to rob you of distance, natural distance, but is also going to rob you of rotation as well. So there are all sorts of different things that can happen when we're not in a good stance with position, whether it's a driver, whether it's an iron, whether it's with chip shots or putts. We're not talking about those today, but those are true as well. So how do we get into this stance with position consistently every time? So I'm going to give you a process here. So this is a process I want you to follow, but I'm also, and it's also a process you can do at home, but I'm also going to give you some spatial awareness drills as well. So first things first, this is going to be tied into the ball position video I did recently. It might have been the last video that I did. I'll put a link at the end if you haven't checked that out. But I'm going to start with my feet essentially together. This is with an iron, and it's going to be with a driver too. And that ball is going to be, we'll say, in the middle of my stance, just as a basic starting point. The longer you club, the longer the club in your hand, you can start it more towards your big toe. But just for basic conversation here, we'll start it in the middle. From here, I'm going to take my left foot, I'm going to drop it out, shoulder, right foot, drop it out, shoulder. So I'm going to start feet together, left foot, right foot, boom. Now I am in the proper setup, but I have a process that my brain can follow, that I can follow to ensure I'm not paying attention to it, because we have to pay attention to this stuff. So again, feet together, left foot, right foot. So my feet are essentially underneath my shoulders. I know I'm in the proper width setup at this point. Now, what about a driver? So I'm going to take that driver. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to start that ball essentially off the big toe. That's for me. Again, everybody's a little bit different, but that's for me. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to take my trail foot and I'm just going to drop my trail foot back. So I'm not going to move my front foot, because I've already established the ball being off of my big toe. That's where I want that golf ball to be, so that kind of ties back into ball position. But I'm going to drop my back foot back. Now, you'll notice there's a potential that my foot is a little further outside of my shoulder, but not much. But again, that process is big toe, drop my back foot back. I am now in the proper position. It is something that if I pay attention to it, I can do it the same way every single time. It does keep your brain on it a little bit because you have to go through that process. So it is in your process as you set up to every golf shot. So it's something I want you to develop into a habit and into a pattern. Now, if you're on the range, absolutely. I want you in a perfect world to do that every single time. But another way to work on it is a simple spatial awareness drill. So I'm going to grab my sticks. So again, all you need is something. I have the 2 snow stakes here. You can use 2 clubs, you can use 2 golf balls, you can use anything for this. And what you can do is simply Place those sticks down on the outside of where your feet would be. So if I get into here, I'd want to put the ball or the sticks right outside. And I like to use sticks because I like them to stick out a little bit so you can see. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to practice in that workstation space. So that allows me to kind of go through repetition. If I'm working on a specific piece of the puzzle in my swing, I don't have to worry about my stance width drifting. It's going to be in the same spot over and over and over again. When you're on the range, and I'm not going to get into how to practice in this video, but I also want you to mix in that process of feet together, left and right as well. But this is another great way, you can do this at home, you can do this in the living room, to really establish what your stance width is. And it just ensures, because these things are there, these guardrails are there, that when you're practicing, you don't start to drift. Because if you do, I mean, you're going to step on the sticks or the ball or whatever you have down there. So stance width is massively important to be consistent because it affects how we move. It affects how we turn. It affects the forces, the vertical forces, the ground forces that we use. You have to be good at your stance width. Now, I'm in the instruction world 24 hours a day, essentially. And I'll be honest with you, there's a lot less of this information being pushed out to people. A lot more is the complicated pieces of the puzzle. Why? Because a lot of times it gets clicks, it gets eyeballs. People assume that they're good at the basics. They're not. I see it every day. Again, not to pick on Ant, sorry buddy, but he's a perfect example of that. A highly skilled player that started to drift, didn't even realize it. You have to work on these things. So let's head back over to the desk, and I'm just going to give you a quick little before and after of how it affected Anthony's golf swing in terms of how he moved. And really, we minimized a lot of his pelvis sway just by getting his stance width back to where it should be. So as you can see, a lot of roads go back to the basics, to the fundamentals, to the core things that we all need to be good at and that we all can control at the end of the day. We have a tendency to look for the complicated things, not just in the golf swing, in life. And a lot of times the answers are the fundamentals, the basics. And stance width is one of those basics that can create a lot of issues that people just skip over the stance width part and they just go to the issues. When in reality, if we just paid attention to these basics from the start, we wouldn't get ourselves into any messes. And that's kind of where I lead back to Anthony, like I mentioned at the beginning. Anthony was very nice to let me share this and hopefully help you guys out there as well. So I've worked with Anthony for 7, 8 years at this point. He's prepping for a tournament on the West Coast. And he was struggling with his driver recently, and he came in for a little tune-up, and quite honest with you, this is where a lot of times tune-ups dramatically help. So one of those things that I talked about on the tee box was how stance width can affect pelvis sway and your lateral motion or excess lateral motion in the golf swing. And that's what I'm going to show you with Anthony. So let's quickly take a look at the before and after of Anthony from his session this week. So you can see the one on the right. It's obvious. I mean, his stance width is tremendously wide, and this is what he came in with. And like I said on the tee box, a lot of these basics are things that we don't pay attention to. Then they start to grow into something more significant. And obviously, that's a pretty wide stance. And if I quickly go into my system, let me show you. This one right here was from 6 months ago? Yeah, 6 months ago. This was his driver. This was his setup. It was great. This was actually the last session that I saw him. This is where he is today with that stance width. These things happen. That's why it's super important to pay attention to it. So what I'm going to focus with Anthony is how it affected his sways, how it affected his lateral motion in his swing, which ultimately resulted in poorer strikes, lower on the face strikes, distance loss because he's not using the ground as well. There's just a lot of things that start to happen that honestly I don't really talk about during a lesson because that's either here or there. I want to see what the change does to those things before I point those out. So I'm going to switch over from his actual swing to the avatar. All right, so on the screen, they're in the same spots. So we have the wide stance to the right, you can see it, the better stance to the left. When I say better stance, I had said to him towards the end, I'm like, I still want to get it a little bit tighter, maybe an inch or two tighter overall.
But obviously there is a significant difference between the stance width here. So Sportsbox, which I use a lot, is a 3D motion capture software that measures a whole bunch of variables in the swing. All I'm doing is pinpointing his pelvis sway and his chest sway. So where you get these 0 inches across the board right now is it establishes your setup at 0. So we're dealing with distance here. So 0 is where his center of pelvis is, center of pelvis, center of his chest is, center of his chest is. Now you'll see as we take back the wide stance, you'll notice his pelvis moves 2.4 inches. It's positive, so that means he's moving towards the target. Chest is moving 1.4 inches towards the target. If we take a look at his narrower stance, he only moved 0.9 inches towards the target with his pelvis and 0.2 with his chest. He actually moved away from the target, 0.2. That's why it's negative right there. So basically his chest and his pelvis stayed relatively centered. Why? Well, there was no intuitive nature to move towards the target. So I'm just gonna interrupt for a second here. I was just editing the video. I just wanna make sure I'm super clear about one thing. So we're talking about a driver here with Anthony, but if a ball position was in the dead middle of your stance, obviously your center is your center. The wider I get, my center is essentially still in the same spot. But as soon as I have a ball position that's forward of center, in our case here, the driver, so I'm taking my trail foot, dropping it back, my center is in X spot. The wider my stance gets, my center gets further back relative to the ball, which means my body is going to have to travel laterally to try to get to the golf ball. And that's what's going on here with Anthony. The wider his stance got, the more he had to travel to get back to the same spot. Now, obviously there's a lot of stuff going on when he's doing that, which is going to interfere with all of the other things that he does really well, which is get into the lead side, create rotation. The wider he got, the more lateral he had to get, which interrupted all of the other things. So I just wanted to make sure I was clear when we're talking about pelvis sway and chest sway. The reason why he has more pelvis and chest sway with the driver is because when he had the wider stance, his center was further from the ball and he had to travel more to get to the golf ball. So I just wanted to make sure I was clear. Let's go back to the desk to wrap it up. Because he knew intuitively he wasn't far away from the golf ball. And that's why it's so important to get that stance width right. Because if you are too far away, even if it's not conscious, subconsciously your body's gonna need to make up that space. It's gonna start to work towards the target more on its own. Now, if I just bring the club down, I'm gonna pinpoint this point in his swing. His chest has moved 5.1 inches at this point towards the target, and the pelvis has moved 7.5 inches towards the target. That's a lot of travel that pelvis has moved at that point. Now, if I just move the better one, pretty much the same frame, his pelvis has moved 5 inches towards the target from where he started, and his chest only 4.2. So he has absolutely reduced the amount of pelvis sway. I would ultimately like to get that a little bit better. The pelvis is still going to move laterally in the golf swing. And ultimately, I do want to tighten that up a little bit more with him. And I think if we continue to play around with that stance width, we could just get that tighter without having to worry about the dynamics of the motion, especially in his case right there. So it just goes to show you how something as simple as stance width can dramatically affect how the body moves and how the body reacts to where it is at address. You have to make sure that your stance width is solid, just like all of those other basics that I've talked about in my videos. If those aren't good, it's going to have a dramatic effect in how you move and ultimately how far you hit the golf ball and how solid you hit the golf ball. Don't neglect those basics. I'll see you in the next video.